How to finish a gun stock. Well, there's a lot of details. There's a lot of elbow grease used in finishing a gun stock. We'll start by sanding the stock with 60 grit paper thoroughly. I'll go to 150 grit paper. I'll go to 220 grit paper. I'll go to 320 grit paper. And looking at the wood pattern and everything else, and sanding with perhaps a handheld laboratory sander where there's flatter surfaces of the stock, and sanding by hand all the radius areas, sanding some of these radius areas with perhaps a wooden dowel or something of that sort, a handheld rubber sanding block that you can mount paper on that'll hold it stationary. All these are invaluable to sanding. So you can pick all sorts of different radius type dowels and one thing another, and for the different radiuses, and you should maintain these radiuses and these curves and one thing and another when sanding. When I have sanded thoroughly with 320 grit paper, now I'll take a small cloth and I'll wet it thoroughly and I'll wring it out, and then I'll dampen the whole exterior of the stock with that damp cloth. This is raising the grain. It's called whiskering. It raises the whiskers. It raises whiskers like raises them up as like 2 days of whiskers is about what it is, folks. And anyway, you sand these off. This is called de-whiskering. It's important that you always de-whisker a stock or it will never come out right. And I'll do that twice to make sure that I've got all the whiskers, and that dampening of the wood. If there's a little scratch or one thing or another from previous papers, this dampening, when it dries, is going to show up as kind of a little fine scratch in the wood. We'll go back with the previous grade of paper and get that scratch out of there and come back with your finish paper. And you might want to dampen that little area there one more time once you've sanded that to make sure that you've got it thoroughly, because we shouldn't see any of these scratches in our finished aspect of things. Now, I use an oil. I use an oil that's a penetrating type of an oil. It's very, very good oil. It's called Watco Danish oil. And a long time ago, I fixed myself with a supply of a dryer that I add to this oil, a small amount of this dryer. When I make up some of this oil, I take a little small container, and I only mix about an ounce and a half of this oil, and about a tablespoon and a half of this dryer. This accelerates the drying because a lot of oils don't want to dry thoroughly. This will accelerate it. There are other oil type finishes that have more of a dryer in it. Some of them that are more tacky, some of them that are harder to use. And I simply take maybe the top off of a jar or something like that I've thrown away, and I'll pour a little bit of this oil in there, and I'll distribute this oil evenly and rub it in somewhat all over the stock. And I always hang my stock up. I like to hang my stock up, where it's warm, specifically where the stock is hanging in the sunlight, because ultraviolet is required to thoroughly cure these stock finishes. And I might put 4 or 5, maybe 6 coats of this on there to make sure that I'm filling all the grain. Right now we're sealing the wood, we're trying to fill the grain. And we get to the point where we look like we've got it fairly filled. Then I'll use some of that oil, and I'll use 320 grit paper or 400 grit paper. 400 grit would be better if you have it. And wet and dry paper. And dampen an area of that stock with that oil and sand that area to where you've got it sanded out level, because that finish that you put on is not going to be all level. It's not going to be smooth. You need to sand this to where you've got it fairly smooth. You need to do the whole entire stock this way, sanding it with the oil on the paper, and make sure that you don't go dry onto the wood, basically, because then it builds up onto the paper. And you can keep repeating this until you've got it thoroughly sanded. You need to wipe it down completely with good absorbing type, like paper towels or something like that, or maybe a piece of an old t-shirt or something of that nature. Wipe that all down, and you can look it all over and see if you got it where you want it. Now there's several ways to go here in the end result. Now this oil that I've been using, I can use that same oil and I can rub that into the stock, and I can rub it vigorously till the stock feels it's getting hot and your hand's getting hot. That basically is curing that oil and hardening that oil, drying that oil in that stock. That's what is described as a hand-rubbed oil finish. But hand-rubbed oil finishes, the oil has to have a good dryer in it, or it won't dry. It's just going to simply become tacky, at some other point in time, unless it's thoroughly dry. This is one approach to be able to finishing a stock, and you can basically, get it however you want. You can build that up that way and use that, and get to a point you can use 4 or 5/0 steel wool dipped in some of that oil and rub that whole stock with that as a final situation. And then once you've wiped that all down thoroughly and inspected it and make sure there's not any imperfections or anything else, you can go back and rub some of that oil by heat into the finish surface of the stock. This is hand-rubbed oil finish. Now, there's also another approach. Once I've filled all these things and I've sanded and maybe used 4 or 5 coats and filled the pores and sanded, wet sanded with the oil on the paper and so forth, I also can change right there, and I use another product called Helmsman. It's a spar varnish in a spray, and it comes in a satin, a semi-gloss, or a gloss. And I use either satin or semi-gloss. I don't use gloss. And you may happen to even, come back with some steel wool and work an area or two or the whole entire stock until you get that just how you want, and spray it. And, buy yourself a tack rag to pick up any lint or any dirt or any dust before you start spraying anything on any of these spray surfaces. So this is a very, very simple situation, but as I say, and it takes time to perfect. I've done, way into the hundreds and hundreds of stocks, and depending on the situation, what we have here. So there are other products out there. There's some very, very good products out there. Brownells has quite a list of products in their catalog for stock finishes and so forth. There's a lot of tools. There's a lot of aspects in the catalog to do with finishing of gun stocks that'll be very helpful for you. Products that they sell, the finishes, the fillers. There's also a filler called French red filler. That's an awful good filler. It kind of slightly reddens the hue of the stock. That's very nice on some woods, and it does a very, very good job. It's got some solid to it along in the oil, and it dries fairly well. But basically, I put that on if I want to use that particular, to fill pores in the stock, and let it dry about 45 minutes, and then with a good rag, wipe off thoroughly all the excess. And I always let these things dry these coats and whatnot, I always let things dry, several days or 3 days or 4. When I'm going to sand anything, I'm going to come after it with steel wool and oil. I like something to dry 3 or 4 days because it's got a good, it's hardened up, it's got a good surface, and it'll take some work, and you ruin your finish. So that's kind of the short of it, of finishing your stock. So it takes a lot of experimenting and a lot of years to figure out what works and what doesn't work, and what products are fine and what aren't. These are the ones that I use. This is what I consistently use and have used for years and years.